Welcome again to the Hive, and thank you for joining us today. We have a really great show. We're going to talk about a speedway rider who never won a major championship, but was always a threat to win that national championship. He was really a good rider. This guy was hot. He raced all throughout the early 70s. And who is this mystery man? He's number 34. He had no nickname. His name was Scott Sivadge. Was born March 31st, 1954, and he lived most of his life in Chatsworth, California. Chatsworth, that's near Los Angeles. And he just had this love for motorcycles since he was a young boy. Scott really just dug on motorcycles. That was his love. Scott and I have something in common. I didn't know that, but at the age of 13, he had a paper route. I had a paper route. And he saved his money to buy his first motorcycle. It was a Yamaha 80. He practiced on that motorcycle for a couple years, and by the age of 15, he started racing District 37, AMA, flat track. He started off as a novice, just a raw rookie, and worked his way all the way up in 1 year to the expert class, and he was ranked number 6. Scott Sivadge was a rider. That just shows you what kind of talent Scott had. He just started from nothing and became an expert, almost number 1 in the same year. He's a little guy. He was only like 5'9", 145 pounds. He's a little guy. Scott Sivadge rode big for a little guy. And he started racing speedway in the early 70s, started racing D3 and quickly to D2. And Scott Sivadge was a good rider, and he was riding that bike hard. I think what helped Scott the most is he hooked up with his buddy Sonny Nutter. Sliding Sonny Nutter. And Sonny taught him how to do the work on the bike, how to ride. Sonny Nutter gave him some tips how to race. Sonny Nutter knew all the tips. He was a pro. And Scott Sivadge was a good student. He listened, he sucked up, he absorbed everything that Sonny taught him, and he could work on his bike, and he became a good rider because of the guidance and the expertise of Sliding Sonny Nutter. In 1972, Scott was a 20 and 30 yard line rider in D2 at the Costa Mesa Speedway and the other tracks. And then in 1973, he stepped up his game. In one of those years, he had a hard time getting a bike, so he went to Sonny Nutter, and Sonny Nutter provided him with a speedway bike and sponsored Scott Sivadge. They were just best of friends. And that was the year that he accelerated. He became a really good rider. He stepped up his game and moved really high in D1. Scott Sivadge was a great D1 rider. I think Sonny Nutter was giving Scott too many tricks, too many tips. He was giving him too many tips. And Scott Sivadge became a really awesome rider. Sonny, slow down, slow down. And Scott just became, he picked up the game, and he was just really stepping it up. That little guy was flying on that speedway track. He was hot and cold, but when Scott Sivadge was hot, that guy was unbeatable. Scott remembers one of his highlights. They had this invitational at the Houston Astrodome in Houston, Texas, and he went there with all the top speedway riders, and the wide world of sports was there filming speedway at the Houston Astrodome. That was before the days of ESPN. Back in those early days, they did trips all over the world, and Scott did some trips to Israel during the off season. They rode all over Europe or Australia, all these places. Scott Sivadge was one of those team members for a few meetings, and he was a world-class rider. And who was the leader of that particular event? It was Sliding Sonny Nutter. Scott also rode in the U.S. versus the World. Here's one of the programs in U.S. versus the World. Yeah, Ivan Major, Barry Briggs, and Scott was racing against all those top guys. And one of his highlights, he beat one of the top riders in the world at that time. His name was Andros Mesnick. And he went ahead and beat Andros Bud, and he had a good time. Scott Sivadge was a world-class racer. Scott was just a single guy, and he just enjoyed hanging out with the guys. The guys like Scott, he was a real personable guy. That is today. He's a good guy. And he just traveled all over the world. He loved it. He was like traveling around, acting like a rock star. He was just enjoying the whole trip. And that was one of his favorite memories, is flying around, riding like a superstar, was living large. He had this passion. He had this heart for racing speedway. And that's what it takes to be a good speedway rider. And Scott Sivadge had that heart and that speedway. Scott didn't just race 1 or 2 nights a week like they do here now. He was racing 5 nights a week on the circuit. And he was just a hardcore racer. He was doing well. It was a full-time job back in those days. And they were making a lot of money. And they were just making that their full-time job because the money was pretty good. And Scott actually had a big string of events. He was winning many races, many main events. I saw those races. And he was just doing excellent. Scott Sivadge was a big rider. He was living large. And every night was a chance for success. Every night was a chance to be the hero. Due to Scott's success, he got many sponsors. People were liking Scott Sivadge. One of his sponsors was Bell Helmets. And then another sponsor he had was a trucking company. And then he had a Garden Grove Datsun. He had this Datsun. I hope they gave him a pickup truck. But Scott Sivadge, he had lots of sponsors. And he was doing really well. He was living large. Scott Sivadge was really a famous rider. You know, when you race 5 nights a week, there's going to be some crashes. You can get banged up. There's going to be injuries, bruises. These guys were tough in the old days. They were old school riders. They knew how to ride hurt. They would have bruises. They'd have injuries. So what? They would go ahead and race. The show must go on. And they didn't let little nagging injuries bother them. They were hardcore, they were old school, they were real men. Like I mentioned, I watched Scott race when I was a little boy back in the day. And Scott was really good. He was just this little guy. And then he would get into his bike with his arms really big, slide into the turn. He was really good. He was aggressive. You know, Scott Sivadge, he had this way about him. He was like owner of the truck. He was just a great rider, and he just went ahead and just did really well. And Scott Sivadge rode big, and Scott Sivadge, for a little guy, was very big. This guy was so good, I thought he was going to be the next Rick Woods or Michael Bass. Just unbelievable talent. I'm like, this guy is going to be a superstar. And he raced in many national championship qualifiers. One year he got 5th place in the national qualifier. People were saying Scott Sivadge, he had a chance to win that title. And one year at the Victorville at Ventura track, he got 2nd place in the track championship. So Scott Sivadge was always a threat to win. Another cool thing about Scott, he raced in the 1976 National Speedway League. He was a shark. Scott Sivadge was a shark. And he was a good shark. He led his team with points with over 8 points a meet. Danny Berserko Becker just a little bit below him. They had a great team. They were all buddies on that team. You had Sonny Nutter, and then you had Scott Sivadge, you had Danny Becker, you had Bobby Boogaloo Schwartz on that team. So you had all these guys that were all buddies. And the Ventura Sharks got 3rd place in that National Speedway League. Behind the Irwindale Sprockets. And the winning Bakersfield Bandits. What a great team. You had Slide, Sonny Nutter, and Boogaloo Bobby Schwartz, a young Boogaloo number 126. Mike Bass, he said this next rider had more talent in his little pinky than Mike Bass had in his whole body. And who was that? That was a very talented and very great rider. His number was 22, and it was Danny Berserko Becker. The Ventura Sharks also had number 4. That was Dave Sims. Dave Sims was a great rider. So you had all these good riders. They had almost an all-star team on the Ventura Sharks. Here in '76 was Scott Sivadge and Slide and Sonny Nutter's pretty much last year racing Speedway. And they went out with a bang. They highlighted with over 8-point average. Slide and Sonny Nutter and Scott Sivadge were awesome riders. And in 1977, there was a special event over at the Bakersfield Speedway. Digger Helm had actually just retired from it, and Billy Gray took over Bakersfield. And they had this special event, and Scott Sivadge was racing in it. I'm not sure how he did, but they had those Hanford, California guys, Grant Sawyers and Martin. Those guys, I raced those guys, and they were bad dudes. And they were the Central Hanford guys, and they went over to Bakersfield, and they raced. They probably won all the things. And Scott Sivadge was pretty much retired after that race. Scott Sivadge. He had no nickname, but boy was he fast. He was a good rider. He was racing for many years. When I first started this show, I thought he raced like 2 years or 3. He raced about 6 or 7 years. He was a rider. And they asked Scott that, if he would do it all over again with all those aches and pains. And Scott Sivadge replied, I would do that all over again. Scott Sivadge.